Imagine this scenario. 120 luxury residences appearing overnight on your property like wildflowers after a storm. The HOA president grinning with satisfaction. Corporate attorneys in $1,000 suits mocking your apparent ignorance. What they overlooked was one crucial detail. I'm a forensic accountant with 15 years specializing in property fraud cases. Speaking of which, where are you tuning in from? Share your location in the comments. I guarantee your HOA nightmares rival this one. They had no idea that each foundation they poured was constructing their own legal downfall. Here's how I transformed their avarice into the most gratifying judicial snare imaginable. The sunrise, I flew back from my half-year consulting assignment in London. Arizona's desert heat felt particularly welcoming against my skin. I was Brian Matthews, 45 years old, finally ready to establish roots on the 50-acre inheritance from my late Aunt Margaret. The rideshare driver kept stealing glances at me through his mirror as we neared what should have been vacant desert terrain. "Are you certain this is correct, sir?" "This appears to be an entire subdivision," he remarked, decelerating. My stomach dropped as I witnessed endless rows of matching tan-colored houses where Aunt Margaret's prairie flower meadows once bloomed. 120 residences, featuring pristine lawns and association-approved postal boxes, occupied my property. The Golden Valley Community placard taunted me with its polished brass typography. I compensated the driver and marched directly to the sales pavilion, where an enthusiastic blonde agent sprang up to welcome me. "Welcome to Golden Valley. Are you considering our second-phase properties? We've already sold 70% of our inventory." I retrieved my ownership documents. "I'm curious why residential structures exist on my land." Her expression flickered, then recovered brightly. "Oh, you must be Mr. Matthews. Victoria Sterling, our HOA president, anticipated your arrival. She mentioned you might experience some bewilderment regarding the development contract." The sales center epitomized suburban extravagance: marble flooring, crystal lighting fixtures, and walls displaying architectural blueprints of an even grander expansion. Phase 2 would reportedly feature a golf facility and recreation center on my acreage. The representative, whose identification read Sarah, anxiously clicked at her workstation. "Mrs. Sterling instructed me to direct you upstairs immediately upon your arrival. Her suite is located on the administration building's upper level." She indicated a sparkling glass edifice resembling a corporate complex rather than an HOA headquarters. Traversing the development, I observed details my forensic accountant's training automatically registered. Streets bore gemstone names: Emerald Avenue, Topaz Circle, Pearl Boulevard. Every house shared identical beige stucco facades with minor trim variations. The landscaping appeared flawless, yet artificial, with every leaf positioned perfectly. Residents exercised their pets or jogged, all regarding me with suspicion. I was unmistakably an intruder on what had been my own land. I encountered Victoria in her luxurious office, where she smugly declared the development completely legitimate. She was 52 with immaculately arranged silver hair and the calculating smile of someone accustomed to successful schemes. Her desk backdrop displayed her Stanford Law diploma and multiple civic recognitions strategically positioned to intimidate visitors. "Brian, delighted you finally joined us," she cooed, sliding a substantial folder across her mahogany workspace. "As documented, we transmitted numerous notifications to your registered location concerning development proposals. Receiving no reply, we proceeded per HOA regulations your aunt endorsed when Golden Valley was established in 1998. She unveiled the folder, exposing countless legal papers, certified delivery confirmations, and public announcements. "Everything followed proper protocol, I guarantee." "But registered location?" I inquired, examining the documentation. My blood chilled upon seeing it. 1223 Oak Street, Aunt Margaret's demolished residence from 2 years prior. The certified delivery records all indicated attempted delivery, invalid address. Victoria's eyes sparkled with satisfaction. "The address we had registered. We followed correct procedures, Brian. Every notification, every deadline, every objection opportunity, properly documented and transmitted to that location." She reclined in her leather seat. "I realize this might overwhelm you, but the development is now irreversible. Perhaps we can negotiate compensation for your cooperation." I studied her expression, noting the subtle mouth twitch I'd witnessed in numerous fraud investigations. "You knew that address no longer existed," I stated quietly. Her smile remained constant. "We're obligated to use registered addresses. We're not responsible for tracking property owners who neglect updating their contact details." She produced another document. "Your aunt executed this HOA agreement in 1998, explicitly stating all official correspondence would reach the recorded address." I rose, maintaining my poker expression, a skill developed through years investigating financial crimes. "I'll require time reviewing these documents with legal counsel." Victoria's smile broadened. "Naturally, but I should mention that challenging this would prove expensive and pointless. We have Morrison Keller and Associates' support. Perhaps you've heard of them." I had. They were the legal predators who demolished 3 environmental organizations opposing a pipeline project last year. Departing her office, I overheard her instructing her assistant, "He'll surrender. They always do." Walking through the development again, I noticed additional details. Security cameras positioned everywhere, private patrol vehicles circulating, gated entrance with guard station. This wasn't merely residential development, it was a fortress. Aunt Margaret's 50 acres had transformed into a controlled environment, regulating every life aspect. I paused where her beloved oak tree previously stood. Now a decorative fountain occupied the space, surrounded by concrete-anchored benches. That evening in my hotel room, surrounded by paperwork and my laptop, I performed my specialty, tracking financial flows. Victoria's confidence troubled me. It wasn't mere arrogance, it was someone's certainty who'd succeeded before. I began with public records and within hours discovered my first clue. Victoria Sterling, previously Victoria Sterling Hutchinson. Attorney license suspended in 2016 for dishonesty, fraud, deception, and misrepresentation. The mystery deepened before I'd even examined the HOA's finances. My phone chimed with an unknown number's text. "Heard about your return. Want the real Golden Valley story? Meet me at Morning Brew tomorrow, 10 a.m. A concerned party, I smiled. Anonymous contacts usually meant guilty consciences or revenge seekers. Either way, they provided excellent information. I responded simply, "I'll be there," and resumed research. By 3 a.m., I'd identified 15 additional properties mysteriously acquired by Golden Valley Management over 5 years. The pattern was obvious. Elderly owners, absent heirs, and consistently those notices sent to obsolete addresses. Morning Brew was a small coffee establishment on town's outskirts, where regulars knew everyone and newcomers were conspicuous. It was deliberately selected, I realized. Distant enough from Golden Valley to avoid surveillance, busy enough for cover. I arrived early, ordered black coffee, and selected a corner booth overlooking the entrance. The morning clientele mixed construction workers grabbing breakfast with retirees, solving world problems over endless refills. At precisely 10 a.m., a young woman in a sharp navy suit entered, nervously scanning the room. When our eyes met, she nodded slightly and approached. "Mr. Matthews, I'm Rebecca Chen. I believe I can assist with your situation." She slid into the opposite booth, her hands trembling as she positioned her briefcase. Up close, I noticed dark circles under her eyes, partially concealed by carefully applied cosmetics. This was someone experiencing sleepless nights. "I previously worked for Victoria," she began quietly. "Fresh from law school, I thought I'd secured my dream position with a successful attorney. She was brilliant, charismatic, everything I aspired to become." Rebecca produced a folder. Then I discovered her actual activities. The Golden Valley HOA isn't simply a homeowners association. It's a sophisticated property acquisition operation. Victoria targets vulnerable properties, exploits obscure HOA regulations to justify takeovers, then collaborates with developers for massive profit flips. She opened the folder revealing meticulously organized documents, emails, financial records, internal communications. I began noticing irregularities 6 months into employment. Properties added to HOA jurisdiction without proper authorization. Elderly homeowners signing documents they didn't comprehend. Forged signatures on crucial paperwork. Her voice hardened. When I confronted Victoria about my concerns, she laughed. Said I was naive, that this was standard business practice. I leaned forward. "Why approach me?" Why not report to authorities? Rebecca's laugh was bitter. I attempted that, but Victoria has connections. She's got judges, city officials, even FBI agents in her network. When I threatened exposure, she blacklisted me, claimed I was a disgruntled employee making false accusations. No firm in 3 states will employ me now. She pushed the folder toward me. But I retained copies of everything, including proof she knew your aunt had died when sending those notices. She retrieved a specific email dated 3 months before I received development notification. Examine this exchange between Victoria and her assistant. She explicitly mentions the old woman's death and instructs her team to proceed sending notices to the invalid address. She even jokes about it, calls it fishing in empty waters. I read the email chain, fury building with each word. The callousness was staggering. The documents were devastating. Email threads between Victoria and her developer partner Jake the Bulldozer Harrison discussing expediting my land takeover, financial records showing millions in offshore accounts. Most intriguing was a technical report about environmental assessments. What's this soil contamination reference? I asked. Rebecca smiled for the first time. That's your trump card. Victoria rushed construction so quickly, she bypassed proper environmental testing. Those houses sit on land requiring remediation first. Every building permit was obtained fraudulently. There's more, Rebecca continued, producing another document set. Your aunt wasn't a random target. She'd battled Victoria for years. Look at these letters. Correspondence between your aunt and various regulatory agencies, State Bar Association complaints, even a private investigator's report. I scanned the documents, recognizing Aunt Margaret's familiar handwriting on letter after letter. She'd understood exactly what was happening and had been building her case. Over the next 2 hours, Rebecca detailed the entire operation. The HOA would identify properties with absent or deceased owners, send legally required notices to addresses they knew were invalid, then claim abandonment rights under an obscure original HOA charter clause. They'd partner with Jake Harrison's development company, build rapidly using substandard materials and shortcuts, then sell to unsuspecting buyers before anyone could challenge legality. They've done this to 15 other properties, she said. But you're different. You possess the expertise to unravel this. And importantly, you returned before they could sell all houses. The timing was critical, she explained, producing a timeline she'd created. Victoria usually waits at least a year after taking possession before anyone realizes what happened. By then, she sold most units, created complex ownership webs, making transaction unwinding virtually impossible. But you appeared just 6 months in. She sold some units, but not enough to make the situation irreversible. That's why she's panicking. Why should I trust you? I asked, studying her face. This could still be an elaborate setup. Rebecca met my gaze steadily. Because I'm why you inherited that land initially. Your aunt was my mentor in law school. She knew Victoria's plans and specifically changed her will to leave property to someone capable of fighting back. She always said you were the family's smartest member, that you'd see what others missed. She produced a handwritten letter. She left this for you if something like this occurred. Aunt Margaret's familiar script blurred as I read, Dear Brian, if you're reading this, Victoria Sterling has made her move. I've watched her circle like a predator for years, awaiting my death. The land isn't just property, it's evidence. Look beneath the old oak tree near the stream. I've buried something to help you defeat her. Trust Rebecca. She's honorable. Love Aunt Margaret. I folded the letter carefully. Looks like we have excavating to do. There's something else you need to know, Rebecca said as we prepared leaving. Victoria's not operating alone. She's part of a network spanning multiple states. The Golden Valley model has been replicated in Nevada, New Mexico, and Utah. They're targeting retirement communities, areas with aging populations, anywhere they can exploit property laws and HOA regulations. Your aunt discovered this, which made her such a threat. She wasn't just protecting her own land. She was trying to expose a multi-state criminal enterprise. That afternoon, armed with shovels and determination, Rebecca and I found Aunt Margaret's insurance policy, a waterproof container holding original HOA documents, recorded conversations, and a diary detailing every suspicious activity she'd observed. The real bombshell was geological surveys, from 1997 showing natural gas deposits beneath the property. That's why Victoria wants the land so desperately, Rebecca whispered. It's not just about houses. She's planning to sell mineral rights to Excelsior Energy for $50 million once she has full control. I spent the evening creating a comprehensive timeline of Victoria's fraud. The pattern was clear, but patterns weren't sufficient for court. I needed admissible evidence, and I needed Victoria to incriminate herself. That's when inspiration struck. Rebecca, how would you like to play double agent? I asked. She raised an eyebrow. What did you have in mind? I outlined my plan. Rebecca would approach Victoria, claiming she wanted back in, that she could help manage the Brian Matthews problem. Meanwhile, I'd play the overwhelmed heir, ready to settle for pennies on the dollar. The HOA meeting was held in the community center, a gleaming building my money had apparently funded. The room was packed with residents, most glaring at me like I was the villain. Victoria stood at the podium, radiating confidence in her power suit. Thank you all for attending on short notice when she began. As you know, we have a situation regarding ownership claims made by Mr. Brian Matthews. She gestured toward me. While we sympathize with his confusion, the fact remains that this development was built legally and in good faith. I stood up, playing my part perfectly. I just want what's fair, I said, letting my voice shake slightly. My aunt left me this land, and now there are houses on it. I don't want to displace families, but surely there's some compensation due. The crowd murmured sympathetically. Some for me, most against. Victoria's smile was patronizing. Of course, Brian. We're prepared to offer you $200,000 for any residual claims you might have. That's more than generous considering the development was approved through proper channels. $200,000? Gunn repeated, then looked down at my papers as if considering. The land was worth at least $5 million undeveloped. Victoria's eyes flashed. Was worth, Mr. Matthews. Past tense. The situation has changed. That's when Jake Harrison stood up from the front row. He was a large man with the kind of tan that came from golf courses, not construction sites. Look, buddy, he drawled, you can take the offer or you can spend the next 10 years in court. Your choice. I let the silence stretch and then pulled out my phone. Before I decide, there's something everyone should hear. I played the recording Rebecca had made yesterday when she'd met with Victoria. Victoria's voice filled the room. Of course, I knew the old bat was dead. That's why I sent the notices there. Brian Matthews was in London, probably sipping tea and eating crumpets. By the time he figured it out, we'd have everything locked down tight. The room erupted. Residents started shouting questions. Victoria's face went from red to white. That's taken out of context, she stammered. But I wasn't done. I also have copies of the real environmental reports. The ones showing contamination levels 3 times the legal limit. The ones you hid from these families who bought homes here. Now the residents were on their feet demanding answers. Jake Harrison tried to slip out the side door, but found it blocked by Connor Lewis, my childhood neighbor who'd become one of Golden Valley's residents. I don't think so, Jake, Connor said firmly. We all need to hear this. Victoria tried to regain control. This is ridiculous. He's obviously fabricated these recordings. I'll be filing defamation charges first thing tomorrow. But doubt was spreading through the room like wildfire. I pulled out more documents. Speaking of legal issues, does anyone know that HOA funds have been used to pay for Victoria's personal legal defense in 3 separate fraud cases? Or that the construction company that built your homes has filed for bankruptcy twice under different names? The meeting descended into chaos. Victoria fled to her office with Jake close behind. Several residents cornered me, demanding to know more. How deep does this go? Asked a young father, holding a baby. Are our homes safe? I chose my words carefully. I'm working with authorities to get to the bottom of this. Your homes are structurally sound, but there are issues that need addressing. I promise you, my fight isn't with any of you. It's with the people who defrauded all of us. That night, Rebecca called with news. Victoria's panicking. She's moving money to offshore accounts and shredding documents. But here's the interesting part. She called someone she referred to as the senator, told him the situation was getting out of control. I smiled grimly. Good. Panicked people make mistakes. What about our federal friends? Rebecca's voice was excited. The FBI agent you contacted? He's very interested. Turns out they've been building a case against Jake Harrison for money laundering, but couldn't connect him to Victoria until now. As I hung up, my laptop dinged with an email from an anonymous address. Back off or things will get very unpleasant for you. You don't know who you're dealing with. Attached was a photo of my house in Boston. I forwarded it straight to the FBI and texted Rebecca. Looks like we're rattling the right cages. Her response was immediate. Victoria just offered me $1 million to steal your evidence and disappear. Want me to take it? I laughed out loud. Absolutely. Let's see how she plans to pay you. The next morning brought a flurry of activity. Victoria had filed an emergency injunction to stop me from harassing residents and spreading false information, but she'd made a critical error. In her haste, she'd included financial documents that actually supported my claims. Her lawyer, a nervous young man who kept adjusting his tie, realized the mistake too late. Judge Patricia Reeves, known for her no-nonsense approach to property law, raised an eyebrow as she reviewed the file. Counselor, did you actually read these attachments before submitting them? The young lawyer whose name tag read Kevin Marsh turned crimson. Your Honor, we filed these documents under extreme time pressure. My client felt it was urgent to protect the community from... Judge Reeves cut him off. From what exactly? From learning the truth about their homes? I'm looking at bank statements here that show systematic transfers from HOA accounts to offshore entities. Is your client aware that financial disclosure in court filings is subject to perjury laws? Victoria, sitting at the defendant's table, was frantically whispering to a senior partner who just arrived. Richard Blackstone, the infamous shark of Arizona real estate law, stood smoothly. Your Honor, if I may take over for my colleague, there's been a misunderstanding about the scope of these documents. But Judge Reeves was having none of it. Mr. Blackstone, I don't care if you're replacing counsel. These documents are now part of the public record. They show clear evidence of financial irregularities that warrant investigation. Meanwhile, Victoria was moving faster than a cat on a hot roof. She'd managed to sell 80 of the 120 homes to unsuspecting buyers, pushing through closings at breakneck speed. But instead of stopping her, I let her dig her hole deeper. Each sale created another victim, another person who'd be standing to sue her. Each rushed closing meant more paperwork errors, more evidence of fraud. Rebecca, playing her part perfectly, was feeding me inside information while pretending to help Victoria cover her tracks. That afternoon, I visited the county recorder's office with a forensic auditor I'd hired, Patricia Quinn. She specialized in real estate fraud and had worked with the FBI on several high-profile cases. As we pored over the deeds and transfer documents, Patricia whistled low. Brian, this is worse than we thought. Look at these signatures. She pointed to a series of documents. Same notary on all of them, but the notary's license expired 3 years ago. Every single one of these sales is legally questionable. I studied the papers more closely. And look at the timing. All these closings happened within a 72-hour period. No legitimate real estate operation processes this many sales that quickly without proper due diligence. Patricia nodded. It's a clear pattern of fraudulent conveyance. She's trying to create so many individual property claims that it becomes impossible to unwind the transactions. Classic asset protection strategy, but executed so sloppily, it's actually creating more evidence. She's getting desperate, Rebecca reported during one of our clandestine meetings at a truck stop outside town. She's pressuring buyers to close without proper inspections, offering huge discounts for cash deals, and I think she's forging signatures on disclosure forms. She handed me a flash drive. I copied everything before she could destroy it, including emails where she explicitly tells Jake to use substandard materials to cut costs. Oh, and there's something else. She pulled out a folder marked Confidential. These are internal HOA communications about something called Project Clean Sweep. Apparently, Victoria's been planning to demolish the original section of Golden Valley, where your aunt's house used to be, and build a luxury resort. The environmental contamination was going to be her excuse to condemn the properties and force sales at below-market rates. I felt my anger rising. So she pollutes the land, uses that pollution to force people out, then profits from redevelopment? Rebecca nodded grimly. Exactly. And she's been using HOA funds to pay off environmental inspectors to look the other way. The corruption ran deeper than I'd imagined. I spent the rest of the day creating a detailed flowchart of Victoria's operations, tracking the money through a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts. By evening, I had mapped out connections to 3 city council members, 2 state legislators, and a federal judge. The pattern was clear. Victoria had built a network of corruption that reached into every level of government. But networks have a weakness. They're only as strong as their weakest link. That evening, I received a call from Special Agent David Chen of the FBI. "Mr. Matthews, we've been monitoring the situation. We'd like to meet." 2 hours later, I sat in a nondescript office building, looking at a wall covered with photos and documents. A sprawling web with Victoria and Jake at the center. "We've been investigating Harrison for 18 months, Chen explained. But Sterling was always too clever, too careful. Until now." He pointed to a photo of a distinguished-looking man with silver hair, Senator William Thornton. "We believe he's been providing political cover for their operations in exchange for campaign contributions." "The senator," I said, remembering Rebecca's intelligence. Chen nodded. "Exactly. Your evidence could be the key to bringing down the entire network, but we need you to do something risky." He outlined their plan. I would meet with Victoria wearing a wire and offer to settle. The goal was to get her to admit to the broader conspiracy. "She's smart," I warned. "She'll be suspicious." Chen smiled grimly. "That's why we're going to make her think she's winning." The trap was set for Friday afternoon, but Thursday night everything almost fell apart. Jake Harrison, perhaps smarter or more paranoid than we'd given him credit for, smelled a rat. He confronted Rebecca in the HOA office after hours, accusing her of being a spy. The confrontation turned physical when he grabbed her arm. What Jake didn't know was that Rebecca had been recording everything on her phone. His threats, his admission that they had dealt with problems like Brian before, and most damningly, his boast that the senator will bury all of you. Rebecca managed to escape and drove straight to the FBI office. By Friday morning, we had a new problem. Jake had vanished along with $5 million from the HOA accounts. Victoria was beyond panic now. She was desperate, which made her dangerous but also sloppy. When I walked into her office that afternoon, wearing a wire under my shirt, she didn't even pretend to be cordial. "What do you want, Matthews?" she snarled. The polished facade was gone, replaced by raw survival instinct. "I want to end this," I said calmly. "You've sold most of the houses. You've made your money. I'll take $10 million and sign whatever you need." Her eyes narrowed. $10 million? You're out of your mind. But I could see her calculating, weighing the cost against the risk. $5 million, she countered. "And you sign an NDA. You never speak about this again." I pretended to consider, then shook my head. $8 million, and I want it in cash tonight. She laughed, but it was a brittle sound. "Cash? What do you think this is, a movie?" But I could see the wheels turning. Cash meant no paper trail. Cash meant she could pay me with the money Jake had stolen. "I know Jake took the HOA funds," I said quietly. "I also know you have access to other accounts. Offshore accounts in the Caymans, perhaps?" Her face went white. "How do you—" She caught herself, but it was too late. "Here's what's going to happen," I continued. "You're going to pay me $8 million in cash. I'm going to disappear, and you're going to pray I stay gone." For a moment, I thought she might call my bluff. Then her shoulders sagged. "Tonight, 10 p.m., the old warehouse on Route 47. Come alone." News of the HOA's missing funds spread through Golden Valley like wildfire. By Saturday morning, panicked residents were gathering in clusters, demanding answers. I called an impromptu meeting at the community center, this time with a very different tone. "I know you're worried," I began, looking at the sea of anxious faces. "You've invested your life savings in these homes. You're afraid you'll lose everything." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. "I want you to know that my fight is with Victoria Sterling and Jake Harrison, not with you. In fact, I need your help to make sure justice is served." I explained the situation in simple terms. How Victoria had defrauded multiple property owners, how the homes were built on illegally obtained land, but how the residents themselves were innocent victims. "Here's my proposal," I said. If you're willing to testify about any irregularities you've noticed, pressure to close quickly, missing inspections, unusual fees, I'll guarantee that your home ownership won't be challenged. Furthermore, any damages awarded will go into a fund to address the environmental issues and ensure your property values are protected. The response was overwhelming. 90% of the homeowners agreed to cooperate. Stories poured out, forged documents, threats, bribes. One elderly couple revealed that Victoria had convinced them to invest their entire retirement savings in a special HOA fund that guaranteed returns of 15%. Another family discovered their home inspection had been completed before the house was even built. Each story added another brick to the wall of evidence we were building. That evening, as I prepared for the warehouse meeting, my phone rang. It was Victoria. "Change of plans," she said, her voice strained. "I'll have someone deliver the money to your hotel." I could hear the fear in her voice. She suspected a trap. "No deal," I replied firmly. "Face to face or I go public with everything tomorrow morning." The silence stretched for long seconds. "Fine," she spat, "but I'm bringing security." I smiled. "Bring whoever you want. Just bring my money." The warehouse was a cavernous space that had once stored agricultural equipment. Now it sat empty, a perfect setting for clandestine meetings. I arrived early, checking for alternate exits and hiding spots. The FBI had wanted to wire the place, but I'd convinced them to stay back. Victoria would bolt at the first sign of law enforcement. Instead, I wore a new wire, state-of-the-art equipment that could transmit even through concrete walls. At exactly 10 p.m., headlights swept across the dusty windows. Victoria entered with two large men who looked like they bench-pressed small cars for fun. She carried a duffel bag that looked promisingly heavy. "8 million," she said without preamble, dropping the bag at my feet. "Count it if you want." I unzipped the bag, revealing stacks of $100 bills. "Looks about right," I said casually. "Now about that NDA." Victoria pulled out a document. "Sign it, take your money, and disappear. If I ever see you again, if you ever breathe a word about this to anyone, you'll—" "What?" I interrupted. "Have me killed like you did with Thomas Brennan?" Her face went ashen. Thomas Brennan was a journalist who'd been investigating HOA corruption 3 years ago. His death had been ruled an accident. "I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, but her security guards exchanged nervous glances. "Really?" I pulled out my phone, showing her a photo. "Because I have a very interesting email where you discuss permanently solving the Brennan problem with someone named Victor." That's when everything happened at once. One of her security guards reached for his gun. The warehouse doors burst open. FBI agents swarmed in, weapons drawn. Victoria screamed and tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. As they cuffed her, she looked at me with pure hatred. "You set me up," she shrieked. "You'll pay for this." "Actually, I think you're the one who's going to pay. By the way, that money you brought, it's marked. The serial numbers were recorded when Jake withdrew it from the HOA account. As they led her away, she turned one last time. "You don't understand. This is bigger than me. They'll come after you." I watched the FBI car disappear into the night, wondering who they were. But that was a problem for another day. Tonight, justice had been served. The news of Victoria's arrest spread quickly. By morning, 3 city council members had resigned, and Senator Thornton's office had issued a statement denying any connection to the Golden Valley scandal. Sure, I thought, just like you'd deny knowing about those campaign contributions. The federal courthouse was packed for Victoria's preliminary hearing. The government had charged her with 37 counts of fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, and racketeering. Jake Harrison had been caught at the Mexican border with a fake passport and quickly rolled by the FBI, agreeing to testify against Victoria in exchange for a reduced sentence. But the real shock came when the prosecutor announced they were also investigating a sitting U.S. senator for corruption. The media went into a frenzy. I took the stand on the third day, walking the court through my investigation. The defense attorney, Richard Blackstone, was known as the Shark, a ruthless litigator who'd never lost a real estate fraud case. He approached me with a predatory smile, his $3,000 suit impeccably tailored. "Mr. Matthews," he began smoothly, "isn't it true that you have a personal vendetta against my client?" That this entire situation is merely an elaborate scheme to extort money from a successful businesswoman? I met his gaze calmly. No, counselor. I orchestrated this situation to expose a criminal enterprise that had stolen millions from innocent people. The only extortion here was perpetrated by your client. Blackstone's smile never wavered. You claim to be a forensic accountant, yet you engaged in deceptive practices, including wearing a wire and pretending to accept a bribe. How is that different from entrapment? Rebecca, sitting at the prosecution table, passed a note to the lead prosecutor. He stood immediately. Objection, Your Honor. The defendant initiated the bribe attempt as clearly shown in the evidence. Judge Carter sustained the objection, but Blackstone wasn't deterred. He spent the next hour trying to paint me as a calculating opportunist, but each attack only allowed me to present more evidence of Victoria's crimes. The real bombshell came when I presented my legal theory. Your Honor, I began, standing to address the court directly. I'd like to draw the court's attention to the case of Whitmore versus Henderson, 1896. Blackstone jumped up. Relevance, Your Honor. We're not here to discuss century-old property disputes. But Judge Carter was intrigued. I'll allow it. Continue, Mr. Matthews. I pulled out a leather-bound law book, a theatrical touch, but effective. In Whitmore versus Henderson, the state Supreme Court ruled that any structure built on private land without the owner's explicit permission becomes the property of the landowner, regardless of the builder's investment or intent. This precedent was upheld in Morrison versus State, 1952, and again in Consolidated Developers versus Williams, 1998. The courtroom was dead silent. Furthermore, I continued, Arizona Revised Statute 42173 clearly states that improvements made in bad faith cannot be claimed by the trespasser. The statute specifically mentions fraudulent conveyance of property rights as grounds for forfeiture. Blackstone was frantically flipping through his notes. Your Honor, this is absurd. These are antiquated laws that haven't been applied in decades. Judge Carter leaned forward. Actually, counselor, Whitmore versus Henderson was cited just last year in Peterson versus Maricopa County. Please continue, Mr. Matthews. I smiled slightly. Thank you, Your Honor. By combining these precedents with the evidence of fraud, we can establish that not only did Miss Sterling commit criminal acts, but she also inadvertently transferred ownership of all improvements, all 120 homes, to me as the rightful landowner. The prosecution team looked stunned. Even Rebecca seemed surprised, though we discussed the strategy. Blackstone was turning red. This is preposterous. You can't seriously suggest that my client built 120 homes only to lose them on a technicality. I turned to face him directly. It's not a technicality, counselor. It's the law, the same law your client tried to manipulate for her own gain. Victoria grabbed Blackstone's arm, hissing loud enough for the court reporter to hear. Do something! Call the senator. Tell him if I go down, I'm taking everyone with me. The judge's gavel came down hard. Order! Ms. Sterling, you will refrain from making threats in my courtroom. But the damage was done. Within hours, Senator Thornton's office was raided by the FBI. The next phase of the trial focused on environmental fraud. I presented evidence showing that Victoria had paid off inspectors to overlook contamination that made the land unsuitable for residential development without extensive remediation. The irony, I told the court, is that in her rush to profit, Ms. Sterling actually increased the liability exposure exponentially under the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. She's now personally responsible for cleanup costs estimated at $30 million. Blackstone tried one last desperate gambit. Your Honor, even if we accept Mr. Matthews' interpretation of property law, which we don't, surely the innocent homeowners who purchased these properties in good faith have some rights? It was exactly the opening I'd been waiting for. Absolutely, counselor. That's why I'm proposing a settlement where I sell each home back to its current occupant at their original purchase price, minus any fraudulent fees or kickbacks. All profits will go into a remediation fund and victim restitution program. Judge Carter nodded approvingly. A remarkably equitable solution, Mr. Matthews. Ms. Chen, does your client support this proposal? Rebecca stood, every inch the competent attorney. We do, Your Honor. My client's primary concern has always been justice for the victims of this fraud, not personal enrichment. The judge turned to the prosecution. Does the government have any objection to this framework being incorporated into a potential plea agreement? The lead prosecutor stood. No objection, Your Honor. In fact, we believe Mr. Matthews' proposal could serve as a model for resolving similar cases of systematic HOA fraud. Victoria suddenly stood up, knocking her chair over. This is a kangaroo court. You're all in on it. The senator promised me protection. He said the fix was in. Her outburst sealed her fate. The judge ordered her removed from the courtroom and revoked her bail. As order was restored, I presented my final piece of evidence, a detailed financial analysis showing how Victoria had used a web of shell companies to launder money through the HOA. Your Honor, this chart demonstrates that over the past 5 years, approximately $47 million flowed through these accounts with patterns consistent with classic money laundering operations. The forensic accountant in me had saved the best for last. The judge called a recess to review the evidence. When the court reconvened, her ruling was decisive. Based on the overwhelming evidence presented, and particularly in light of Ms. Sterling's own admissions made in this courtroom, I find sufficient grounds to proceed with all charges. Furthermore, I'm granting the plaintiff's motion regarding property ownership, subject to the proposed restitution framework. As we left the courthouse, Rebecca turned to me with admiration. That was brilliant. How long have you been planning this? I smiled. Since the day I found out about Whitmore versus Henderson. Sometimes the best trap is the one your enemy builds for themselves. Victoria was so focused on exploiting technicalities that she never considered they might be used against her. The evening news led with footage of Victoria in handcuffs, screaming about conspiracies as she was led away. The headline read, HOA, President's Greed Becomes Her Prison. Landmark case sets new precedent. 3 months later, at Victoria's sentencing hearing, the courtroom was again packed. The judge's words were scathing. Mrs. Sterling, you betrayed the trust of hundreds of families, corrupted public officials, and showed callous disregard for both the law and basic human decency. This court sentences you to 25 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. As the gavel fell, I thought about Aunt Margaret. Her plan had worked perfectly. She'd known I'd find the legal angle everyone else had missed. Sometimes the best revenge really was living well. But in this case, it was even better. It was turning their own weapon against them. The final pieces fell into place over the next 6 months like a perfectly orchestrated symphony. Victoria Sterling received 25 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. During her sentencing, she stood before the judge, a shadow of her former self, and delivered a statement that made national news. I let greed blind me to the harm I was causing, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I destroyed lives, families, and communities. I can never make full amends, but I hope my cooperation helps bring down others like me. Her testimony had indeed been instrumental in dismantling a network that spanned 12 states and involved over 200 corrupt officials. Jake Harrison got off lighter, 15 years thanks to his early cooperation. He provided detailed financial records that helped recover over $30 million in stolen funds. The real earthquake came when Senator William Thornton's trial began. The man who'd once wielded immense power now sat in the defendant's chair, facing charges that could put him away for life. His fall from grace was Shakespearean in its completeness, from respected lawmaker to the face of political corruption in America. As for the 120 homes, the solution was more elegant than anyone expected. I sold each house back to its current occupant for exactly what they'd paid, minus any kickbacks or fraudulent fees they'd been charged. The environmental cleanup was completed using funds recovered from the criminal enterprise. The land's value skyrocketed once word got out about the natural gas deposits, but I'd already made arrangements. The mineral rights were placed in a community trust, with profits funding local schools and environmental protection programs for the next 50 years. Connor Lewis, my childhood neighbor turned HOA victim, was elected as the new community association president. His first act was to rewrite the bylaws, ensuring transparency and requiring supermajority approval for any major decisions. Never again, he told me over coffee one morning. We're going to make this a real community, not a scheme. The residents, once suspicious of each other, had bonded over their shared experience. Block parties replaced HOA meetings, and the community garden flourished where Victoria's office once stood. Rebecca Chen's trajectory changed overnight. The young lawyer who'd been blacklisted became the go-to expert on property fraud. She opened her own firm specializing in protecting homeowners from predatory HOAs and corrupt developers. Within a year, she had offices in 3 states and a waiting list of clients. "I owe it all to your aunt," she told me one day. "She saw something in me worth saving." We'd found more of Aunt Margaret's letters hidden in the property. She'd been documenting Victoria's activities for years, building a case she knew she wouldn't live to see completed. Former Judge Harold Winter's testimony had opened another Pandora's box. His detailed accounts of judicial corruption led to a massive Department of Justice investigation. 17 judges across 6 states were indicted, their cases reopened, and hundreds of wrongful foreclosures overturned. Winter died peacefully in his sleep 3 months after testifying, finally at peace with his conscience. His funeral was attended by many of the families he'd helped in his final act of redemption. The ripple effects continued to spread. States began passing new laws to protect property owners from HOA overreach. The Matthews Amendment, as it became known, required multiple forms of verified notification for any HOA action affecting property rights. Law schools added courses on HOA governance and property fraud. The Golden Valley case became required reading in ethics classes, a cautionary tale of how unchecked power and greed could corrupt entire systems. On the anniversary of Victoria's arrest, I stood in the community center addressing a gathering of residents, local officials, and press. "This victory belongs to all of us," I said, looking at the faces that had become familiar over the past year. "To everyone who stood up, spoke out, and refused to let corruption win. To my Aunt Margaret, who saw this coming and prepared the ground for justice. And to this community, which chose unity over division, truth over convenience." After the speeches, as people mingled and shared stories, I found myself standing where my aunt's wildflower field used to be. Now it was a playground filled with laughing children. Their parents watched from nearby benches, no longer worried about mysterious fees or threatened foreclosures. Connor approached, handing me a cold beer. "You know, Brian, when you first showed up, some of us thought you were the enemy. Now look at this place." He gestured at the thriving community. "Sometimes the best revenge really is living well." As the sun set over Golden Valley, I thought about the journey from that first shocking morning to this moment of peace. The forensic accountant in me appreciated the neat resolution of debits and credits, justice balancing the scales. But the human in me found deeper satisfaction in the community that had emerged from the ashes of corruption. As I walked back to join the celebration, I could almost hear Aunt Margaret's voice on the evening breeze. "Well done, Brian. Well done indeed." The wildflowers were gone, but something even better had taken root. A community built on trust, transparency, and the unshakable belief that justice, though sometimes delayed, will always find a way to prevail. Looking back, I realized that Victoria had been right about one thing. She had fallen into a legal trap, but it wasn't one I had set. It was one she'd built herself, brick by brick, with every fraudulent document, every forged signature, every family she'd tried to destroy. In the end, the very laws she'd twisted to serve her greed had snapped back like a rubber band, delivering the poetic justice that makes for the best kind of ending. The kind where the good guys win, the bad guys pay, and a community discovers that together, they're stronger than any corrupt system that tries to tear them apart. Sometimes the best revenge truly is turning their greed into your community's gain. And if you're watching this from a place where HOA horror stories are all too common, remember this: document everything, question authority, and never underestimate the power of ordinary people united against injustice. Because in the end, that's what this story is really about. Not just my victory, but ours. The victory of every person who's ever felt powerless against a system designed to crush them. We're proof that with persistence, intelligence, and a little help from friends, even the mightiest Goliaths can fall.